Hello. When we are talking about um, forgetting, right? Um, I did just mention in the previous video, of course, Henry Molaison um, as an example. I mentioned amnesia, but they make the point in here. There are any number of reasons why we might forget information. And the first one they actually say with Henry Mathiasson is that the information is not encoded to begin with. You just didn't focus on it enough to get it into long-term memory. That's why you can forget some things, right? So it just doesn't get in there. And with Henry Mathiasson, since the hippocampus was removed, the information was just never encoded into his long-term memory, right? For new explicit or declarative memories. And they point out in there, they have this nice figure of pennies on page 340 in your textbook, right? And don't look at an actual penny and don't look at the answer right there. But we see pennies. We've seen pennies for years, right? Some of us for decades. And we can't even identify the correct penny out of that group. Right? If we don't look at the answer, it's hard to identify the correct penny even. That should give you an idea of how bad memory is. It's just, yeah, it's terrible, right? But then, of course, they do mention, other than it not being encoded to begin with, we can forget too because information just decays away over time. The memories just fade and decay away over time. And I did mention, and they do mention in the book, I think I mentioned in a previous video, is that Ebbinghaus, when he was studying memory, found that right after you learn material, initially, like in the first few hours after you've learned it, you forget. It decays away really fast, right? Most of it decays away really fast. So you've got that. Now what remains is usually there for a pretty long time, but it also decays over time as well. So yeah, sometimes memories will just fade away to a certain extent. But then another idea though is that it's in there, we just can't retrieve it. So we can forget for that reason too. We just can't retrieve the information. It's in there, we just can't find it, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced that when you're taking a test. Oh, I think I know this. I can't, and you just can't quite find it, right? That's a retrieval failure. And they do mention in there that we talk about interference. There is a lot of research on human memory that shows that a main reason we forget information is that we just can't find it. Other memories are interfering with the memory we're trying to find and retrieve. And they do mention, and this can be confusing, in there are two different kinds of interference that we can talk about: proactive interference and retroactive interference, right? Proactive and retroactive. So proactive interference, I'll just stick very briefly to the definitions as they say in the book, right? Proactive interference: the forward-acting disruptive effect of prior learning on the recall of new information. Okay, that's a terrible definition, but I guess you need to be able to recognize that definition that the book uses, because you do. But it's basically, if information I learn first can interfere with me remembering information that I learn later, right? So if I study intro psych, and then so I study for 4 hours for intro psych, and then I study for 4 hours, I don't know, for sociology for sociology. Well, when I'm taking the sociology test, I can't remember the sociology. The intro psych stuff keeps coming up, right? That'd be proactive interference. So something I learned first interferes with me remembering something I learned second, right? That would be proactive interference. And then retroactive is the other way around, right? I study something first, then I study the second thing, and the second thing can interfere with me remembering the first thing. That would be retroactive interference. So interference can happen both ways, right? Something I study first can interfere with me remembering what I studied second. That'd be proactive interference. And then, you know what? Something I study first, and then I study something after that. The something I study after that can interfere with me remembering what I studied first, right? So the book definition of retroactive interference, right? The backward acting disruptive effect of new learning on recall of old information. Right? Learn this, then I learn this. This later stuff interferes with me remembering the previous stuff. Right? So you got proactive and retroactive interference. Yeah, there just can be interference all over the place, right? And then lastly, they do say there is the possibility of motivated forgetting, where we just do not want to remember some things, right? And I suppose some of this could be Freudian type stuff where, maybe memories can be repressed into the unconscious mind, although there's a lot of debate about that. They mention next in the chapter about, whether or not memories you retrieve much later that were supposedly repressed, whether or not those memories are accurate or not. But let's assume, and presumably sometimes they are accurate. So it was just too threatening, so you just forgot it. And then sometimes people just don't want to accept the truth. I would imagine if I had a loved one, that was a murderer, I might just try to actively tell myself, no, that's not true, and I'm not going to remember that. I'm not going to think that. I'm just going to remember the good things. And that might be a version of motivated thinking too, I suppose. So there is some of the stuff I'm forgetting. So I really like this figure though they've got there on page, 343 in your book, right? Figure 8.22, right? Where they show you have all these dots in these figures. Starts with sensory memory, right? You have incoming visual stimuli. Let's say that other sensory modalities too, but you have incoming stimuli. Briefly, that's held in sensory memory. Then only some of that moves on to short-term or working memory, and then only some of that becomes encoded in long-term memory, and then only some of that you can retrieve, right? So memory is just terrible. It's awful. And of course, that's what they get into next in the textbook, some controversial stuff regarding eyewitness testimony, repressed memories, all that sort of stuff. So that's it for this video.